You'll never know how much I really love you. You'll never know how much I really care.
This story began about 5 days ago, but I've only now just got around to writing it down. I'll take my time to make sure I share everything with you, and the fact that this whole ordeal hasn't once left my mind makes me feel certain that I won't miss any details. It's going to be a very long story, maybe too long for some people, but I just need some sort of explanation to keep me from feeling insane. I'm hoping that if I write it all down, maybe I or someone else can make some sense of it, as little as that may be. Well, I suppose this story actually began 48 years ago, and the only reason I know anything about it is because of my granddad. From the 60s up until the late 80s, my granddad used to work on the ships as a deckhand. He worked on many different ships under the wing of many different captains, and so the sea, being the exciting place that it is, left him with hundreds of stories to tell. When I was a young boy, I would continuously ask him to tell me these stories, even the ones I had already heard. Some of them were gruesome, some of them were funny. There were even a few sad tales, but only one of them was genuinely scary. I remember almost all of the stories that he'd shared with me, but I think it's obvious which one stood out the most. My granddad was 23 in 1964, and he'd just been drafted onto a ship that was delivering cargo to countries in South America. It was no different than the other two ships that he'd been previously working on, except maybe it was a bit bigger. I won't give the real name of the ship, but for future reference, we will call it the CWS. My granddad began the story by explaining to me just how strange the captain of the ship was, how he was a lot happier and friendlier than other captains he'd worked with, but only during the day. Once the clock was nearing midnight, he would become paranoid, angry and agitated, the complete opposite to his day-walking self. He would scurry around the ship, briskly rushing everyone onto their private quarters, ignoring any questions they would ask. Then, just before locking each door, he would stare into the eyes and plead with them not to try and leave their rooms until the morning came. Almost everybody listened. At this point, I should mention that the captain had an annoying habit that the crew had to put up with. He would sing "Do You Want to Know a Secret?" by the Beatles every day, all day, without fail. And that's the only song he would sing. Even in the night, they could hear him humming the tune from behind his locked cabin door. After being on the ship for a week or so, all of the sailors were beginning to grow more and more annoyed at the actions of the captain. His seemingly split personality, his constant singing, all of his annoying traits. But most of all, it was the way he locked everyone in their rooms at night, almost as if they were children not to be trusted. That was until one night changed the way they were feeling. It was the usual time of night when the captain would dart about, clumsily rushing everyone to their cages. But one of the deckhands, JP, had a plan. Earlier on in that day, he had altered the lock on his door so that he could open it from the inside of his room with ease by using a magnet. My granddad was told that JP had the intention of getting everyone else out of their room for a party on the lower deck. So naturally, they were all excited and ready for a night of drinking. With his ear up against the door, my granddad listened intently to what was going on outside of his room. Over the captain's monotonous pop song droning, he heard the lock snap open and a hushed creak of a lone metal door. Just as footsteps began echoing throughout the empty halls, the humming stopped. As my granddad winced at the door in annoyance, he heard, all of them heard, vicious thuds and screams of pain, howling and scratching at the floor while JP begged for help. His cries were growing fainter, almost as if he was being dragged through the ship, lower and lower into the steel abyss. As the fading remainder of his pain erupted from the halls, My granddad stepped back in horror as all movement outside the door had stopped, and the damp corridor echoed silence. The next morning, as the door snapped open, nobody wanted to step outside, but they had to. After mustering enough courage, my granddad finally stepped out into the hall as the most putrid odour he'd ever smelt surrounded him. Holding his nose and gagging, he looked around to see a small puddle of what looked like blood and oil mixed together. The only assumption that the crew could come up with was that the inmate had simply gotten out and sustained an injury. Curious as to what the captain would say, they all got ready for a day of work. They sprinted through the foul-smelling hall and onto the upper deck. Once they arrived upstairs, they noticed the captain was already up there, singing his usual song as if he didn't have a care in the world. In an uproar, the crew questioned him on what had gone on the night before, but they didn't get an answer. He just sang. None of them ever saw JP again, and the next 3 months were the longest of their lives. The rest of the time on the ship was dictated by the captain. The crew became quiet and despondent as the Beatles rained over their eardrums. The work they once loved had become dreary, and the ship felt like a prison. The crew would never question the captain, and none of them would dare leave the room after hours. Until one night, a couple of months after what had happened to JP, my granddad finally had enough, and curiosity got the better of him. He took on the same plan as JP had, except he was going to be more careful. As my granddad said, if it wasn't the captain's fault, I needed to know for the sake of us all. It was 2:03 AM, and my granddad finally mustered up the courage to approach the door. He took the magnet and slowly began to ease the lock to the left. A second or so before the lock snapped open, the humming stopped, and a huge bang echoed violently through the darkness. He forced the door forward with all of his strength, hoping that whatever was out there wouldn't get in, but nothing tried to. He slowly inched the door towards him, enough so that he could peer into the dimly lit hallway in front of him. As he did so, he heard the quiet pitter-patter of something stealthily bounding towards him within the darkness far ahead. The smell came back and filled his room. After taking a moment to gag into his sleeve, as if out of nowhere, a heavy panting made itself known from it just outside the door. After momentarily freezing, he slowly began to react to the situation he was in. I don't know why he did it, or how he got the courage, but he gazed back, out into the hallway. My mind has never forgotten the look of sincerity and terror on his face as he described to me in detail what he witnessed in that corridor. In my granddad's words, it was a four-legged creature that had thick, razor-sharp hair that seemed to be coated in oil or tar. I don't know if it was the smell or the fear I was feeling, but it made my vision quite hazy for a moment and gave me the worst pain in the back of my head. It was on eye level with me when it was on all fours, so I can't imagine how big it would have been if it stood upright. It had black hooves on its hind legs, but it had what looked like black clenched human fists on the front legs. Its face was the worst. Where its mouth was were just 3 holes in the left, right and centre of the usual place a smile would occupy. It looked as if they had been ripped to create something resembling a grimace, then joined together by 2 large slices in between. Its eyes were shaped like that of a cat's, but with a white sclera, all black pupils, much larger and turned on their sides. It stared right at me, eyes widened, opened its mouth to reveal hundreds of razor-sharp, dark yellow teeth, and let out a deep, human shriek. That's when I slammed the door and locked it and passed out for the night. After that incident, my granddad was never curious again. He still had another 2 weeks, and then he knew he was off the CWS for good. For the remainder of the time there, he stayed silent like the rest of the crew. Every now and then, he'd go to tell someone what he'd witnessed, but he decided it would be best to just stay quiet. Leaving day couldn't come fast enough, and as he hopped off the ship with the rest of the crew, he looked back at the CWS for one last time. As the captain waved off into the distance, singing his song, while his new crew got to know the ship. A year or so later, my granddad heard from a friend that the ship had been found off the coast of Argentina, completely abandoned. After that, he never heard anything of it again. My granddad is 71 now, long retired and happy as ever. As I picked the local newspaper up last week, his memory was jolted, and what must have felt like a dream or a nightmare made his heart drop. The CWS was docked at an old harbour, not 3 hours away from where he lives, and is being used as an attraction to bring a bit more money to the area. I was sure that my granddad would see it as a tour of his worst fears, but nonetheless, he looked at me, almost instantly, and said, "We have to go." So we did.